Hi guys, so this is lesson 4E, and it's really the final topic that I want to talk about in terms of our much larger concept of style, and that is tone. So really this isn't a part and parcel of the concept of syntax, which we've been talking about a lot thus far. But of course, tone is something that's created by syntax, just as it's created by diction as well. And it's one more of those things that we can really use to be categorizing and describing and giving some kind of personality attribution to an author if we're trying to draw a conclusion about what their style is. Well, style is partially generated by tone. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, guys. Like I said, an offshoot of the whole concept of style, not necessarily syntax or diction, but really it comes quite significantly here at the end because it is an accumulation of all of that other stuff. And so if you're doing a rhetorical analysis, tone is one of those things that pulls in all of the other details and makes a generalization about style that really should never be neglected or ignored if you're trying to do a rhetorical analysis. So that's that as a little introduction. So let's dive into this if we can, please, folks. So what is tone? Well, tone is a writer or speaker's attitude toward the subject conveyed by stylistic or rhetorical choices. So that's the definition. It's a very clinical kind of definition that you've got right there. As it says, it is the writer or speaker's attitude. So you're giving us some kind of description of what that writer or speaker is like. You're telling us that the person who is telling the story or recounting the text or the voice or persona behind the essay, they have a certain personality trait that is attributable to them through the style of their language, and it is fill in the blank. That's their tone, okay? As I mentioned to you a couple of moments ago, this isn't just a single self-contained thing. It's coming from lots of different areas. It's coming from diction, it's coming from syntax, it's coming from figurative language. All of those things are contributing to what kind of tone a text is going to have. So really, like I said, it's kind of an accumulation of all of this other stuff that we've been talking about, and as a consequence, becomes infinitely more important as a result, okay? So the way I like to think of it, the way I like to talk to students about it is this. Tone is often an adjective or an emotion that can be used to describe the writer's/speaker's personality or state of mind. So if you walk away from a text and you say, wow, that speaker was fill in the blank, that's probably their tone, okay? Like I said, I say either an adjective or an emotion. Sometimes an emotion is what describes that tone pretty well. Sometimes it's a more generic adjective of some sort to describe their personality, but it's a way of saying, okay, they might not have told me specifically what they were thinking and what their personality was like, but if I just went off of the kind of language that they use and the way that they use it, I would describe that particular writer/speaker as fill in the blank. There's your adjective, there's your emotion, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about tone, okay? One of the greatest ways that authors can sort of be, embedding within their text that concept of tone is through the use of connotations, okay? So that's an important idea that we need to come back to at this point in time. So remember, connotations are the things that are sort of underneath the surface of a word. They're not denotations, they're not dictionary definitions, but they're sort of underneath the surface, stimulating the reader in a way that isn't quite literal, isn't quite obvious, but nevertheless has those kind of social or emotional effects upon the reader/listener, okay? And that makes connotations one of the biggest contributing factors to tone. The fact that, well, if I'm writing something and I'm specifically choosing language that is, let's say, more negative than synonyms for that same language that are more positive, that's going to deeply affect my tone. And so you'll see that's one of the big factors that contributes to tone, okay? What tone are we using in situations? Well, just like I'm going to tell you guys in almost everything that we do in this class, it should always be reflected of in the rhetorical situation, okay? Regardless of whether we're doing rhetorical analyses or argumentation or synthesis, at the end of the day, the big question you always need to be asking yourself is, well, what is the rhetorical situation? And as a consequence of that rhetorical situation, what's the appropriate tone in that rhetorical situation? So, like I said from the very get-go of this class, rhetorical situation is the single biggest thing that we talk about. That's really because it informs all of the decision-making that we do after this. Okay? As a, result of that as well, you can also, in your rhetorical analyses, be asking yourself, okay, this is the rhetorical situation for this text. This is the tone for this text. Is the tone appropriate? Is the tone not appropriate? What makes it appropriate or inappropriate? Those are great contributing things that you could be talking about whenever you're doing any kind of rhetorical analysis, okay? Shifts in tone are often undertaken for rhetorical effect, including qualification, refinement, or reconsideration of the writer's perspective or argument. So that's one of those things that really, if it's available to you in some of the text that you have to read for the AP test, the graders are going to be particularly attentive to how attuned you are to that. The fact that a tone isn't necessarily something that's consistent from sentence one to the last sentence. Sometimes the author's going to shift. Sometimes the author's going to change that tone deliberately for an express purpose, just like you too can do that when you're writing your own rhetoric. And so trying to determine how the tone has changed and why it decided to change right then and there, well, those are important components of a good rhetorical analysis. So we say qualification, as in they're adding some sort of caveat to whatever the argument is. Refinement, maybe they're getting more specific into specific situations or something like that. Or maybe they're just rethinking their whole argument. It's certainly a rhetorically advantageous process sometimes to make an argument and then actually second guess your argument in some ways, which we'll talk about when we get into some more of the different rhetorical strategies in the future, but it's an option. So be attentive to that concept of shifts in tone during the course of a text, okay? Now, they are typically going to be indicated by a transitional word or phrase or a rhetorical question. So if there is a big shift in tone, it's probably not just going to be thrown at you without any warning. Chances are there are going to be some clues, some tips along the way that really make you think, okay, so yes, I think this is one of those shifts is being undergone right now. Okay, what was the tone previously? What is the tone now? Stuff like that. So usually there will be something transitional to really make that more obvious, okay? One of the things we also need to be particularly attentive to is making sure that we differentiate tone from mood and stance. Particularly tone and mood is one of those things that every English teacher will teach every single year because it has a tendency to be a little bit more confusing, and they seem synonymous in a lot of ways, but they're not necessarily, okay? So what are we talking about when we're talking about the concept of the mood? Well, this is the feeling or atmosphere created by a text. In short, how you are led to feel. What is it making you feel? That's very much the mood. And if you juxtapose that with what we talked about a couple of moments ago, remember that the tone is how you would describe that writer or speaker. So that's not the same thing as mood. The mood is the feeling or atmosphere that it creates in you. The tone is going to be the adjective or emotion that you would use to describe that author, that speaker, whatever the case may be, all right? And keep in mind, that could sometimes be very contradictory. The mood and the tone can be very contradictory to one another. I mean, just to use a very extreme example as a demonstration, I mean, if you think about a text that is narrated, for example, by a serial killer, compare that to what your mood is going to be reading this text by someone who's got this very skewed, very different perspective than, hopefully, you do, and you're going to see, okay, well, their tone doesn't match the mood at all that I'm experiencing right now. Sometimes that is the case. The stance, however, is going to be the speaker's attitude toward you, the audience, okay? Their attitude toward you, the audience. So this is going to be a big factor when we're talking about ethos and the fact that you want to make sure that they're properly disposed to you, they being the audience, of course, and that they like you and that they trust you and all of those kinds of things. So you want to have a stance that's going to be very welcoming and accepting and sort of compatible with your audience. And that is obviously going to be something that influences your mood. It's obviously something that's going to be influencing your tone, but it's not going to be the same thing as that stuff. So here's my little summary down here. Ergo, mood is what the text makes you feel. Tone is the emotion/personality of the writer toward the subject, and stance is the emotion personality of the writer toward the audience. So that's just my little synopsis of how you can differentiate between all of those things, okay? One of the things that can really establish tone from the get-go, especially a preliminary tone before it might be changed later on, is an epigraph, okay? Not an uncommon thing to do, whether fiction or nonfiction, truthfully. A question that precedes a text that helps set the text's mood or suggests its message. Okay, so a lot of times that question, this rhetorical question of sorts, can help the people to really get a sense of, okay, this is the path we're going down. This is the kind of text that I'm about to be reading. This is the kind of person or persona who's going to be leading me through this content. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is, of course, dominant impression. This is the main impression or effect that writers attempt to create for their subject. So you can see how that's going to overlap in a lot of ways with concepts such as tone and mood and stance. So the big impression that you take away from it arises from the author's focus on a single subject and from the feelings the writer brings to that subject. So you're almost saying, what would you say is the writer's, a generalization of what the writer feels about whatever that subject has a tendency to be. So you have to sort of decode that dominant impression, presumably by taking a close look at things like tone and mood and stance along the way, okay? The second to last topic that we need to get into, and hopefully this is all a review for you guys out there, is that concept of point of view, because that's going to be a big factor as you're talking about tone and so forth as well. Of course, when we're talking about point of view, we're talking about the angle from which a writer tells a story. So these presumably are familiar from past classes, English classes in particular. So just some things to keep in mind. Personal informal essays take the first person POV. They can, which is natural and fitting for essays in which the author wants to speak in a familiar way to the reader. So remember, a lot of English teachers, particularly higher level English teachers in your recent past, might have told you how terrible and horrible and evil it is to ever write in the first person. And they're not wrong, okay? There are a lot of academic situations where it is terrible and evil to write in the first person. But remember what we've said many, many, many times before about rhetoric. Rhetoric is about doing the most persuasive thing. So the question isn't, is first person right or wrong? The question is, which is going to be more effective, first person or third person? And if the ultimate conclusion is first person, well then rhetoric says, whoa, you just go with the thing that's more persuasive. That's what we do, okay? So if ever you're confused about whether my expectations are for first or third person, by all means just ask me and I'd be happy to talk with you about that. Because yeah, sure, there are some things I'm going to expect from you in third person and some things that I'm not, okay? The third person POV has a tendency to distance the reader somewhat from the writer. This is useful in essays in which the writers are not talking exclusively about themselves, but about other people, ideas, and events. So that's an important concept to think about. What is the distance between speaker and audience? Sometimes you need to have that distance between them for one reason or another. Specifically, as it mentions in that particular bullet, if the topic of consideration isn't the speaker or the speaker's life themselves or the speaker's observations and stuff of that sort. But on the flip side of that, think about how much more intimacy is there when you've got the first person point of view. And sometimes that's exactly what you want and exactly what you need to really establish that rhetoric. So you need to be choosing appropriately in those situations. Like I said, there's a right and a wrong time for both of these. And to the extent that I'm able to allow you to, I'm going to let you guys figure that out and make the choice on your own. But like I said, academia has a tendency to say, oh, it should all be in third person. Rhetoric says, oh, wait a minute. Well, let's not jump to any conclusions, okay? And that's what I say right down here. The majority of academic and professional writing you do both in AP language and composition and in college should be in the third person with minimal or no first and second person. But like I said, depending on what the medium is and the assignment, it's a conversation that I'm more than happy to have with you guys, okay? Last topic to talk about with tone is the concept of irony. And we've talked about irony before, but we really need to bring it up in this context as well. Specifically because one of the things I didn't make mention of when we were talking about irony in the figurative language section was the three types, which hopefully you've heard of the three types, or at least two of the types before, and these aren't going to come as a complete surprise, but they have a tendency to really discolor and change and affect tone, specifically verbal irony. And so it's one of those things that, well, you can't really neglect or ignore when you're talking about the overall tone of a text. So the first one is actually the one that we already talked about, verbal irony. I believe I just called it irony back when we were talking about figurative language, but now I'm being more specific in calling it specifically verbal irony. So this is the figure of speech that occurs when a speaker or a character says one thing but means something else, or when what is said is the opposite of what is expected, aka sarcasm. So I've explained that to you. I don't need to go into any more depth about that, I don't think. That's exactly the same thing that we talked about back when we were talking about figurative language. And hopefully you can get the sense of, if you truly understand what that's all about, how that's really going to alter what the tone of a text is. That's really going to change sort of the personality of the writer-speaker if they are espousing a great deal of sarcasm or minimal to no sarcasm on the contrary side within the scope of their text, okay? The other things to keep in mind are just as relevant, although different. In the case of dramatic irony, this is drama as in it makes things all the more dramatic, not to mention it's something that would have happened a lot in the old plays, like this happens all the time in Shakespeare. So it's when tension is created by the contrast between what a character or writer says or thinks and what the audience knows to be true, okay? Think about that from a perspective of, I mean, if you're reading an essay, and maybe the essay is specifically about a person who's telling you, for example, on the day they got ready to go to work on New York City on September 11th, 2001, okay, and they're just brushing their teeth and, doing all that stuff in the morning. Meanwhile, you, who has some backward light, as Faulkner would have called it, know that, oh my gosh, this person's going into New York City on the day of 9/11, okay? That's dramatic irony, okay? They're writing in a way that it creates the tension and the drama because you have information, you have details that they don't necessarily have, okay? And the final type of irony is situational irony. This is basically a surprise. In any situation, something that's a surprise would be an example of kind of like situational irony. So a pointed discrepancy between what seems fitting or expected and what actually does end up happening, okay? So if there's any kind of surprise, any kind of thing where maybe a character is anticipating the raise at their job for the entire scope of the movie, and then in the last 5 minutes they actually get fired instead, well, that's a situational irony. All of this expectation leads to that surprise, okay? And just as a little note, is specifically if we are talking about verbal irony, the irony that is most contributive to the concept of tone, generally speaking, an author is going to use a lot of hyperbole and understatement as the basis for creating that sarcasm. Okay, they're going to be speaking in a lot of exaggerations and a lot of understatements as a way to really demonstrate that they're sarcastic and have that verbal irony as the undertone to their tone, really, okay? So those are some things to look at there. So that's tone, and again, if I summarize tone in its simplest way, it's what I put up here, right, this is the big thing to keep in mind. Tone is often an adjective or emotion that can be used to describe the writer-speaker's personality or state of mind. That's the big thing. So you really, no matter whether you're doing a rhetorical or analysis or not, one of the first things you do when you walk around away from a text is usually ask yourself that question. If I were to describe the speaker of this text, how would I describe that speaker? Okay, fill in that blank. That's identifying tone in a lot of ways, okay? So that's all I got to say on that stuff, friends. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to bring them to class with you the next time I see you. And I will see you shortly, guys.